Advent messages. Okay? Beginning with a recognition of the very nature of the gospel. But before we do that, let's speak a little bit about that word Advent. You see, in Christianity, it is a very important word in some churches. In some churches, the word Advent is always used with a capital A, and it speaks of a special time or season of the year. Okay, the word itself, even with the common A, that speaks of the arrival of a notable person or thing. But in some of our churches, it speaks of a time of the year, a season, when we anticipate the coming of Jesus. Churches like ours, evangelical churches, we do not usually follow what we call the Christian calendar. Well, not in its entirety. We celebrate Easter and we celebrate Christmas in line with what we call the Christian calendar. But in other churches, each Sunday of the year is dedicated to a special time, a special observer. So for instance, in those churches, you will have people celebrating, we all know about Lent, even though we don't celebrate Lent, okay? And then there's also the Feast of Pentecost or Whitsuntide that many churches celebrate that we don't celebrate. But Advent in more traditional churches is celebrated over the 4 Sundays before Christmas Day. So this year, the first Sunday of Advent is actually the last Sunday of this month. So how come Pastor David doing an Advent message from now? Well, we are free from the constraints of following a particular calendar. And since it's 4 Sundays, and I'm going to preaching 2 Sundays this month and 2 Sundays next month, I started my Advent reflection from now. Not true. Okay, great. So today we want to start off with what I said at the very beginning. Today our message focuses on the nature of the gospel. And it has much to do with this understanding of the great majesty of God. That's how we started in our praise and worship. He is coming down and has come down in the form of Jesus, who died for us on the cross of Calvary. This is a message that we hear almost every single Sunday in church. So the question is, what is so different with what we are doing today? I'm hoping that as we reflect on Advent and start our Advent reflections today, focusing on the gospel, that something that we say will have some meaning to you, will be meaningful to you, and help us to draw closer to our Lord and find in him a greater sense of well-being. The first Sunday of Advent, as we celebrate the gospel, and in traditional churches, the theme is usually hope. Hope. And that's what we want to talk a lot about today as we speak about the nature of the gospel. And to make it easy for us, I'm focusing only on one verse. Mark 1, verse 1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's all verse 1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so what I want to focus on today, as I want to make 2 points about the gospel, that the gospel is precious news and that the gospel is peculiar news. I wonder if you can remember those 2 words. Think you can remember them? Next week, can I ask you, think you remember it? You sure? So tell me the 2 words again. And peculiar. So we're going to talk a little bit about those things and why we see in this gospel the whole picture of hope as we continue today. The word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which actually means, you want to guess? Good news. That's your bright congregation. It means good news. It actually first meant a reward for good news. But over time, in the olden days, many, many centuries ago, it eventually dropped the idea of the reward and just became good news. By the time of the New Testament, when Mark wrote his gospel, it had the particular kind of understanding of good news coming from God. Good news coming from God, and it specifically spoke to the coming of Jesus, the message of Jesus. The English word itself, gospel, is from an old Latin word that was actually Godspell, Godspell. And the word God there speaking of God's story or good story. Spell meaning story. Over time, the D, which is what in Latin and Greek we call a dental. Those are letters that we pronounce with our teeth, tongues and teeth. Okay. The dental D fell out of use and it was replaced by the dental S. So it became gospel. But it's talking about the good news or the good news that comes from God. Now, when Mark wrote this thing and he says the beginning of the gospel, there's something else that we must say that was in the minds of the Jews as they would have read or heard this. And that is a passage from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 52, verse 7. And some of us older folk know this verse from a song that we used to sing in church. It says, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaim peace, who announce news of happiness, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns. Isaiah 52 is a wonderful picture proclaiming to Israel an invitation for her to come out of her captivity. She had been taken into captivity by Babylon, and she had spent 70 years approximately, and she had served her punishment. Israel understood her captivity as a punishment upon her for her sins, her idolatry. She had been taken away by the Babylonians into captivity, and the good news, the gospel, was that your time of bondage is over. God had made peace with her and was now bringing her back into her own sphere. For years, they had thought that God had forgotten them, but now the good news of deliverance came. And so the only appropriate response was, our God reigns. He's not dead after all. He's still with us. Poor Israel. At the time of Jesus, they were once more being ruled by evil political masters. Though God had delivered them from the Babylonians in the past, and from the Media Persians and the Assyrians, they were now for almost 100 years under the rulership of the iron fist of the Romans. The Romans had taken over their land, and their daily lives were actually hell, we could say, as they faced the atrocities of these political overlords. You see, the Romans had brought a measure of safety to Israel, but it was safety at a high price. In order to keep the place safe, the Romans actually had an ulterior motive for keeping the place safe. They believed that if they kept the place safe, they'll keep themselves in power. And in order to do that, what they did was that they had a severe system of taxation upon the people. Very heavy taxation that the average Jew, where actually anywhere where Rome ruled, this was true, but here among the Jews, the average Jew had nothing for himself. The Romans could come and take at a moment anything he had in order to take care of the army. That army could move swiftly across the empire to keep peace. So what it meant is, for instance, here is this Jewish family who spent their every single day planting their crop and caring for their field, and they're looking at harvest. Harvest is finally come, and they are looking at a bountiful harvest, and the Romans just came in, could just come in and just take it away. Boom, we have use for this crop, and boom, suddenly you're gone. Apart from that, the Romans continued their taxation by levying. They had their own tax collectors who would go around and get that. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we move on. Rome was so oppressive that it created great divisions among the people. And we come to understand this because we as a people, when we live under hardships, we become divisive too. We try to splinter, everybody trying to find life in some way. Okay, everybody aligned to some group trying to survive. So for instance, there were these religious parties that developed in Israel over 2 or 3 centuries, all pushing for what they thought was right and how best to align yourself. So for instance, you had the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were the biblical party, so to speak. They were the ones who were more spiritual, and they held on to the word of God and tried to show how they were more authentic and more faithful to God, and so should be followed. It was important that they get the fellowship, if there's such a word, the following of the people, because they survived on the free will offering of the people. The Pharisees were paid by the people, so it was important for them to get a big following. But then there were the Sadducees, another so-called religious party, which was really more a political party, because under the guise of religion, they sold themselves to the people as though they were religious. But what they were is that they aligned themselves to the governing authorities. And because they were aligned to the governing authorities, they got lands and wealth and prestige. And they also got the rulership of religious matters in the land. A council was created called the Sanhedrin. And in the Sanhedrin, Rome gave the Jews the right to rule over political and daily disputes as long as it didn't deal with capital matters. And Rome mandated that the Sanhedrin should be divided between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But in support of the Sadducees, they gave the Sadducees 1 more vote than the Pharisees. So the Sadducees themselves, who did not believe in the Old Testament, apart from the first 5 books of the Bible, they had the rulership of the land if there was a division, there was a disagreement on religious matters. But there were many other parties. For instance, there were the Herodians. The Herodians were a party that aligned themselves to the Herods. Who were the Herods? The Herods were vassal leaders, or leaders who were set up by Rome to give the guise that Jews were ruling themselves. But the Herods themselves were answerable to Rome too. And then just to mention one more political party, because you had some people who were definitely against all of this. We had the Zealots. The Zealots were daggermen. That's a very, in case you older people don't understand, that is a very loaded word to young people. When we talk about daggermen, it doesn't mean what you guys think. These guys walked with daggers, ready to murder anybody who supported the governing authorities. Because they said, Israel is the land of God. We must rule our affairs under the guise of, well, not the guise, under the power of God. And any foreign overlord or anybody who supports those foreign overlords, we must get rid of them. They were like the suicide bombers of the day. The point is that people were lacking in hope, and so they were clinging to anything that gave them hope. Among the common people, they couldn't escape because Rome had appointed publicans, tax collectors who would ensure that whatever you worked and earned, you had to pay your part to Rome. And this is how it worked. The tax collectors were paid a very basic sum, but usually it's by commission. The more that they collected, the more they get. And what Rome would say is, give me X. And if you collected 3 or 4 or 5 or 10X, the brata was yours. And so you had this condition, this time where the Jews hated the tax collectors. You claim not to be political, but you are supporting an oppressive system by thieving from us. Do you realize Zacchaeus said to Jesus, when Jesus told me salvation has come to your house today, he says, if I have wronged anybody, I'm going to pay them back 4 times what I have taken from them. Zacchaeus is repentant, and he's giving back the money that he got from the people. He was living high on the hog, so to speak. That's a very bad terminology to use for Jews, okay? But he was living a very high life, while the people who made him wealthy were struggling for survival. This was a land in which the good news came. It is to these people who find themselves at a place of hopelessness. They are at this place of tearing out their hair, wondering what's going to happen to them. And the good news comes to them. It is precious news that something was about to be done to deliver the people from their horrible condition. It was the news that the people were longing to hear after years of oppression. But the second point becomes important. It was peculiar news. Peculiar news. What do I mean by that word? That word peculiar sounds like it means strange. But in preparation for this sermon, and as I went, I learned that peculiar has what we call a wider semantic range than just strange. Okay? The word also can mean specific, pointed, a news that is distinct from others. This good news had characteristics about it that set it apart from any other claim of good news. What do I mean? It was news about a person coming to deliver God's people, and everything about it centered around that person. He is described by 3 pictures or 3 words. And we're going to look at them to show you how specific, how peculiar this news, how different it was from any other claim of good news. You see, this good news, and I'm going to talk about these 3 words, they appear in the text, one after the other. I'm going to look at them in backward order. It says that he is the Son of God. Don't be fooled by that designation, son, in the statement, Son of God, as Muslims tend to be. Muslims are offended by the idea that Jesus is the Son of God, because in their mind, it suggests that a holy God cohabited with sinful man to produce a son. Okay? That's the only way they understand the term son. But when the Jews spoke of son of someone, they sometimes had a different understanding or different usage of that word. For instance, there were some people who were called sons of the Torah, which meant that they were characterized by the teachings, the word of God. When you saw that person, when you saw that man as a son of the Torah, what you knew about that person is that they lived their lives in accordance to the Torah. Okay? Sometimes it was not so positive. Like, for instance, James and John were called the sons of thunder because their temper was short. At the drop of a hat, they were ready to fight. Lord, let us call down fire upon them people right now. Kind of a thing like that. In my days in primary school, we'd say them hot patty. You know about hot patty? Only old people know about hot patty. Young people don't never play hot patty. When you want to pick a fight, hot patty, hot patty, hot patty. God, you play that in school? No. God was a good saint from him was born, you know. Okay. So the idea of son also had this thing of being characterized or being of a particular ilk. And what it was saying when it says that Jesus is the Son of God, it was describing him in a way that the Jews would never describe anybody. Because God has characteristics that no one shares. To say that Jesus is the Son of God was to make Jesus equal to God. And in John chapter 10, we see this coming out when Jesus asking the people, why you vexed me for? No, no word said that ye are God. So what's the problem? He's saying, Jesus was throwing some word at them. And they say, we have no problems except that you say that you are the Son of God, making yourself equal to God. It's important for us to see that Mark wants us to understand that this gospel is about God's Son, somebody who is coming from God, who shares particular characteristics with God that nobody else does. And he was coming not like some politician who's going to promise, but this is a God of the universe who cannot lie, who's going to come and he's going to do something to deliver people from their hopelessness. God himself was going to act on their behalf. So he is described as the Son of God. But he's also described as the Messiah. The word Messiah means the anointed one. And the word is used in the Old Testament to speak of the kings who were anointed by the priests to be leaders over God's people. They were servants of God who were to bring God's rulership to the land through their righteous reign. So the priests would pour this oil over them, over their heads, as a sign that they were now imbued with the Spirit of God. So everything that they did was to represent God's justice and goodness in the land. They were God's representatives as kings over the land. Of course, we know that the kings weren't that good. In fact, Israel's greatest king, David himself, very often did not represent God in the way that he should. But if you read the Old Testament and you read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you will see that half of Israel had a few good kings and the other half of Israel had no good king. The kings did not represent God in the way that they should. And the people of Israel were warned about it, you know. The prophet Samuel said to them, Samuel the prophet and the priest, was he a priest? Yes. He warned them when they clamored for a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8, he says, if you get a king, the king is going to abuse you. It's not time for you to have a king yet. And they said, give us a king. We want to be like the nations around us. And they got their king. They got their anointed ones who were anointed, it seems, only to do their own bidding, not to do what God wanted them to do. So injustice and corruption reigned. And isn't that still happening all around the world? Where politicians rule. Now, I'm going to say every last one of them, but most of them do not represent God, even if they claim to do so. So here comes the good news to the people. They want to hear it. God's Messiah, the anointed one from God, is coming. And so their ears perked up and their hopes swelled. God was finally going to act on their behalf. The Gospel of Mark is about the Messiah and how he would deliver the people from their oppression. Well, I need to warn you up front. The way God's Messiah will work may not be in the same way that the people envisioned. It's not the same way that we kind of think that he should work. I happen to think that I know a little bit more than God. Don't you feel that way sometimes? You don't feel that way? God, why you allow that man to live? If I were ever God, I'd just zap him. You don't feel that way before? God, why you spare Jamaica again from hurricane? Haiti and Belize can't take anymore. We know more than God. Sometimes it's the way we feel. And we're going to find out that the way God operates through this Messiah is very different from what the people often thought. Okay? But in Mark, when the people accepted this Messiah's message, you will see that they walked in deliverance. They walked in deliverance that God had in store for them. So what we need to do is learn from the Gospel of Mark as we read it to see how God delivered the people through the Messiah and seek that deliverance for ourselves. So this peculiar message is about, remember the first point I mentioned, it's about the Son of God. It's about the Messiah of God. And the third one, it's about Jesus. Very specific, narrows down to Jesus. And he could not be any more specific than this. I am not telling you the news about some great man out there somewhere in the world or another great man somewhere. This is specific to one person, to Jesus. Whereas he could make the proclamations that the people could hold on to as general truth, he now identified the one who was to be the answer to their problem. It was Jesus of Nazareth, who was the Son of God, the Messiah who they were longing for. So in the whole book of Mark, do you know how many times the term Son of God is used for Jesus in the book of Mark? Take a guess. 50? Good guess, but you're wrong. It's only used twice. In this verse and in chapter 15, I think verse 39. And in both times, it's a full recognition of who Jesus is. In this verse, Mark is declaring who Jesus is. And in chapter 15, verse 39, the centurion is declaring who Jesus is. But in the rest of the book, nobody gets it. The closest we get to it is in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, where Peter says, "You are Messiah." But he stops short. Why? Because he still has an understanding of how the Messiah ought to have operated based on the Jewish expectations. And the sad news about the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus' closest followers never get the message. even up until the very last verse of the gospel. Mark 16, Mark chapter 16, verse 8, they still don't understand. It was so scandalous that scribes later on added endings to the book to soften the end, to make it seem as though the disciples understood better. Of course, we know that later on, after the resurrection, not recorded by Mark, we know that they eventually see it. And Mark's gospel is traditionally thought to be Peter's reflection of Jesus. Mark was his nephew who wrote down Peter's story. So Peter got it. But in the Gospel of Mark, they never recognized the true identity of Jesus. And that's why Peter could rebuke him when he said, the Son of Man, when he says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and die. Peter could rebuke him because what he was saying didn't make any sense to them. The Messiah can't dead. The Messiah will come and kill off the Romans. How come you're going to talk about you're going to get killed by the Romans? Or killed by anybody? That just didn't make any sense to them. The truth is that as the Gospel of Mark unfolds, Mark's presentation of Jesus makes his identity clear. We often then come to realize that, like the Jews, we ourselves have imposed our ideas on Jesus. We think that he ought to operate in ways that we want him to operate. And isn't that why it is that when we speak about the message of the gospel, some of us believe that it's not good news, it's bad news? What do I mean by that? I think this is true of many of us, that when we were first exposed to the gospel, what we got was Jesus is a cosmic killjoy. He's going to call us into a relationship with him that he may deny us our freedoms. He's going to deny us our fun. And so, God, let me live some life first before I come to you. In other words, when I come and I give myself to you, the thinking is that the best part of my life is over. I'll give you the what's left. I'm happy to see these young people who have come to us after camp. Now, speaking to some of them, and that's what one young man told me. He says, sir, the gospel makes some claims on my life. He didn't use these words, I'm paraphrasing him. The gospel makes claims on my life that I'm not prepared for right now because I must live and enjoy myself first. I'm learning that anytime we point our fingers at others, as Brendan would always say, what does it mean for me? And this is exactly what we all do from time to time. When the gospel makes claims on us, that is just too hard for us. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, tells us that we are to live in particular ways, and it's just too difficult to do right now. So I won't do it. I won't do it. I seek hope in my own way of understanding. So he tells me to forgive, but that's too hard. I'll have somebody else forgive that person. He tells us to help someone in need. That's too difficult. It's too costly. Costs too much right now, and I have my own agenda to follow. He tells us to cut off particular types of relationships. And we say, that's much too difficult, Lord. It's much too difficult. Let me do my way first. And that's the way we go. Why? Because we do not believe the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to say, as I bring this to a close, the first Sunday of Advent coming the last Sunday of this month, but the first Sunday of this month for us, is the message of the gospel that says to us, in Jesus Christ, God has acted on our behalf to bring hope. It is when we accept Jesus and live according to his way that we find the full blessings of God's life. And so I end by asking you, what is in it? What is in your life that you need to yield to Jesus? The Messiah has come to deliver you. You can't deliver yourself. And there are some people who might need to yield their lives to him fully because you have never done it yet. He calls you to come to him. All of us have things about ourselves that we need to constantly yield to him, because that's how we will find life. Jesus calls us to himself. What will your response be? What will my response be? Amen.